300 feet under the North Sea, a man's lifeline tore in two, and his world went black. Chris Lem wouldn't stop hearing the voices in his helmet. The warm water that had kept his suit alive stopped flowing. The gas he breathed shrank to whatever was left in two small cylinders strapped to his back by every number that should have decided his fate. He had roughly 5 minutes left. No ship above him, no light, and no way up. This is the story of a diver stranded alone on the seabed in total darkness, and the half hour that should have killed him. To understand how a man ends up there, you have to understand a trade most people never hear about. It is called saturation diving, and it sits among the most dangerous jobs on Earth. Far beneath the waves, oil and gas companies bolt heavy steel structures onto the seabed. Pipelines run between them, valves control the flow, and manifolds tie it all together. When something fails down there, no machine can match the patience of human hands. So men are lowered to depths where the pressure would crush an untrained body. To survive that pressure, a diver lets his blood and tissues saturate with gas until his body matches the deep. Once that happens, he cannot simply come up rising too fast, would let the gas tear out of him like foam from a shaken bottle. So these divers live for weeks at a time inside sealed steel chambers no larger than a small caravan. They eat there, sleep there, and wait there, pressurized to a world far below. The helium they breathe pitches their voices high and thin, almost cartoonish. For company they have each other and a crackling line to the surface. Every shift a diving bell carries them down through black freezing water. Their single link to life is the umbilical. It is a thick bundled cord that feeds them, breathing gas, hot water, electricity, and a voice from the surface. Sever that cord and a diver becomes an astronaut whose air hose has been cut loose in space. On the 18th of September 2012, 3 of these men were at work in the North Sea. The site was the Huntington oil field about 100 miles off Aberdeen on the Scottish coast. Floating above them was their home and their lifeline, a dive support vessel called the Bibby Topaz. The ship had one task that night: to hold dead still over the dive site whatever the sea threw at her. Down in the saturation chambers lived Chris Lem, an experienced commercial diver. He was calm by nature, well liked by the crew, and good at a job that left no room for panic. Working alongside him was a second diver, just as seasoned, who said little and watched everything. The overseeing them from inside the diving bell was the bellman, the man whose voice would guide them home. The plan was ordinary: drop to the man eye fold, finish the repair, and return to the bell. Far above, the weather had turned mean. A heavy swell rolled under a black, starless sky. 90 meters down, none of that storm could be seen, only felt as a slow, distant heave. The bell was lowered, and Chris and the second diver swam out into water barely above freezing. Taut water pumping through their suits held the cold at arm's length. Their helmet lamps cut thin cones of light into a dark that swallowed everything past a few feet. They reached the man-eye fold, the steel structure they had come down to fix. Chris clipped on, settled into the rhythm of the work, and began. High above, the Bibby Topaz kept her place against the rolling sea. The system that held her there was called dynamic positioning. Computers read the wind and the waves, then fired the ship's thrusters to cancel every push. Without it, a vessel that size cannot stand over one point in moving water. For a while, everything ran exactly as it should. Then something inside that system quietly broke. A fault stopped the ship's computers from speaking to one another. In moments, the Bibby Topaz lost her grip on the sea. The storm took her at once. The big ship began to slide sideways, shoved by wind and wave. Below her, 2 divers were still tied to the seabed by their umbilicals. On the bridge, alarms tore through the night as the crew fought for control. Down on the structure, Chris and the second diver felt themselves being dragged. It started as a gentle pull, then it turned violent. The ship was hauling them across the steel like fish on a line. The bellman's voice came through, hard and fast. Get back to the bell. There was no time to weigh anything, only to move. The second diver clawed his way back toward the bell and its open hatch. Chris was caught on the far side of the manifold, his umbilical snagged in the steelwork. The drifting ship kept pulling, and his cord drew tight. The slack vanished, and the tension climbed. He grabbed the metal and fought to free the trap line. For a few seconds, the umbilical held against the weight of an entire ship. Then it gave way. The cord carrying his gas, his heat, his light, and his voice ripped apart in the blackness. Chris fell back onto the seabed, 90 meters down, completely cut off. The voices were gone. The warm water draining through his suit turned to ice. His lamps died, and the dark closed over him from every direction. All he had left was his bailout, set 2 small cylinders meant for a few minutes of emergency gas. He was breathing heliox, a blend of helium and oxygen, and it was thinning with every breath. He could see nothing, and he could hear only his own breathing inside the helmet. Far above, the lights of the Bibby Topaz were sliding away into the storm. He worked out in the cold and the dark that the ship was gone without her. The bell could not reach him, and his colleagues could not come. 5 minutes of gas was nowhere near enough time to be rescued. So he did the only sane thing left. He hauled himself back up onto the manifold, the last place the ship had seen him. If anyone ever came looking, this was where they would look. He lay down on the cold steel and tried to slow his racing breaths. Every breath he saved was a few more seconds of life. The cold sank past his skin and settled into his chest. He thought about the family waiting for him on shore. He pictured the people who would have to be told if he never came up. Then he stopped fighting it and let his mind go quiet. At some point, the bailout gas ran thin and his body began to shut down. He lost consciousness on the manifold, alone with no one near enough to help. By the clock, his time had already run out. The minutes that followed were minutes no human is supposed to survive. And yet 90 meters above the seabed, the story was not over. The crew of the Bibby Topaz had not given up on him. On the bridge, the team was scrambling to take back control of the drifting ship. They switched from the failed computers to manual command. Turned on the controls, an officer began driving the huge vessel back toward the dive site. It was slow, heavy work against a storm that wanted her gone. Meter by meter, they clawed the Bibby Topaz back over the spot where Chris had vanished. In the dive control room, the supervisor kept his voice flat and steady. He had a man on the bottom and a clock that had already beaten him. The second diver, safe back in the bell, was told to get ready to go out again. He would have to descend into the same black water that had nearly taken them both. As the ship steadied over the site, the crew sent down their eyes a remotely operated vehicle. A small underwater rowboat trailing its own cable dropped toward the seabed. Its lights swept across the structure, hunting the dark for a shape that should not still be there. Then the camera found him. Chris Lamont lay motionless on the manifold, exactly where he had chosen to wait. He was not moving, and he was not breathing, and by every sign they were too late. But the bell was overhead now, and a diver was already on his way down. The second diver followed the robot's lights down to the manifold. He found Chris limp on the steel, his belt long since empty. There was no time to check anything properly. He took hold of his friend and lifted him off the structure. Then he carried the still body up through the dark toward the open hatch of the bell. Hands reached out and pulled them both inside. They laid Chris on the floor of the bell, gray and unresponsive. The bellman cleared his airway and gave him 2 hard rescue breaths. For a long moment, nothing happened. The men around him waited for a sign that would not come. Then Chris Lamont drew a breath of his own. His eyes flickered and his body stirred. After roughly half an hour with no working gas supply, he had come back. There was no medical reason it should have worked. The freezing water that nearly killed him had also slowed his body almost to a stop. The cold had bought him the minutes his lungs could not. Within minutes he was talking, dazed but alive, asking what had happened. The men in the bell could barely believe what they were looking at. They sealed the bell and lifted it back up to the ship. Chris was returned to the saturation chambers, still held under the pressure of the deep. He could not be rushed to a hospital, because his body still had to be decompressed slowly. Over days, astonishingly, he walked out of that chamber with no lasting brain damage. A man who had spent half an hour without gas at the bottom of the sea was somehow whole. Investigators later picked apart what had failed on the Bibby Topaz that night. The breakdown traced back to the ship's positioning system, losing its reference and its ability to hold station. Those findings fed back into how dive support vessels guard against that kind of failure. Backup systems, drills, and procedures were tightened so one fault could not strand a man again. Chris Lamont went back to diving, the same trade that had nearly buried him. Years later, his story reached the wider world through a documentary called Last Breath. It put faces and voices to a rescue that sounds impossible even when you know it is true. The men on the Bibby Topaz had refused to treat a body as a body while there was any chance left. They drove a crippled ship back through a storm for a colleague the clock said was gone, and a diver who should have died alone in the dark lived to tell it himself. The sea almost kept Chris Lemoons that night. 90 meters down in water that does not forgive. It is a reminder of how thin the line is for the men who work where no one was ever meant to go. If this story stayed with you, follow the channel for the next forgotten disaster we pull back into the light.